What if the strongest person in the room is the one who says absolutely nothing? What if every immediate emotional reaction you have, the sharp reply, the defensive message, the heated comeback you can't take back, isn't a sign of honesty, but a silent, automatic surrender of your personal power? For decades, we've been told that quick wits and fast talkers win the day. That confidence means speaking your mind without hesitation, that the person who fires back fastest has the upper hand. But neuroscience and history tell a very different story. From the desk of Abraham Lincoln to the boardrooms of Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, the world's most effective minds share one counterintuitive superpower that looks like a weakness to everyone around them. They refuse to react immediately. They have mastered the space between, a psychological gap that most people sprint past without even knowing it exists. A gap where, as we're about to discover, your growth and your freedom actually live. But the most surprising part of everything you are about to learn is this: most people are not just untrained in how to use this gap. They are biologically wired to miss it entirely. In the autumn of 1997, at a developer conference in Boston, a man stood up from the audience and publicly attacked Steve Jobs. He didn't ask a question, he delivered a verdict. He accused Jobs of not knowing what he was talking about, of destroying everything he had ever touched, of failure, arrogance, and intellectual dishonesty. The room went completely still. In our modern instant reply culture, a world of clapbacks, live streaming every emotion, and the expectation that silence equals weakness, we would expect a sharp retort, a defensive blast, especially from a man who had just returned from exile to save a company from the edge of bankruptcy. Surely Jobs had something to prove. Instead, he sat on a stool, head slightly bowed, silent. For 18 seconds, he said nothing. He sipped from a glass of water, he looked at the floor, he breathed. And the entire auditorium held its breath with him. When he finally spoke, he did not attack the man. He did not defend himself. He did not even directly answer the accusation. Instead, he offered what would become one of the most composed and strategically devastating responses in Silicon Valley history, speaking slowly, calmly, with absolute authority about where Apple was going and why it would get there. The audience, which moments before had been braced for confrontation, was completely disarmed. That pause was not an accident, that pause was a weapon. This is what elite performers, master negotiators, and the world's most effective leaders have discovered, sometimes through deliberate practice, sometimes through hard experience, and what most people will go their entire lives without understanding. Psychologists call it the rule of awkward silence. Jeff Bezos uses it. At Amazon's most critical executive meetings, Bezos begins not with a PowerPoint, not with a summary, but with 30 full minutes of silence. Everyone reads a memo, nobody speaks, nobody reacts until they have completely absorbed the material. The idea is simple and radical. Surface-level reactions are almost always wrong. You need time and information before your response has any value at all. Tim Cook uses silence differently. In high-stakes negotiations, he is known to let a pause stretch until it becomes physically uncomfortable for the other person. And what invariably happens is this: most people cannot tolerate the void. They fill it themselves. They over-explain. They make concessions they had not planned to make. They reveal their position before the negotiation has even properly begun. The silence that looked like weakness turned out to be the most powerful move at the table. Naval Ravikant has said it plainly: the most valuable skill in the modern age is not being the smartest person in the room. It's being the most unfoolable one. And the first step to being unfoolable is refusing to fool yourself by reacting before you've thought. So why do these extraordinary minds consistently choose awkward silence over the speed they could easily deploy? Because they understand something fundamental about the human brain that most people never learn. They know that an immediate reaction is almost never a choice. It's a hijack. Psychologists have confirmed something deeply uncomfortable about how our minds respond to social threat. Our brains process a social slight, being ignored, being criticized, being dismissed, in the exact same neural pathways that process physical pain. This is not metaphorical. The brain cannot reliably distinguish between being punched and being publicly embarrassed. This means every time you fire back an angry message, every time you snap at someone you love, every time you send that text you'll regret before morning, you are not making a choice. You are reacting to pain. And pain, it turns out, has a very specific and very well-mapped home in the brain. To understand why we react the way we do, we have to go back to the work of one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century, Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman is a Princeton professor who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, not for studying markets or interest rates, but for studying something far more fundamental: how human beings actually make decisions. And in particular, how often we get those decisions catastrophically wrong, even when we are smart, well-intentioned, and fully convinced we are being rational. He proposed a framework that is now so influential it has fundamentally reshaped how researchers across psychology, economics, medicine, and law think about human behavior. He called it System 1 and System 2. System 1 is your mind's autopilot. It is fast, it is automatic, it is intuitive, and most critically for what we are discussing, it is deeply, fundamentally emotional. System 1 is the part of your brain that swerves the car away from a hazard before you have consciously registered it. It reads your mother's mood from a single syllable of her voice. It recognizes a familiar face in a crowded room in less time than it takes to blink. It helps you walk and hold a conversation simultaneously, which would be impossible if every step required deliberate thought. System 1 is extraordinary at pattern recognition. It is fast because it doesn't pause. And it doesn't pause because, in the evolutionary environment where it developed over hundreds of thousands of years, pausing could get you killed. But System 1 is also the source of every snap judgment, every misread situation, every knee-jerk reaction you've ever regretted. It is fast because it skips the part where you think. Then there is System 2. This is your analytical mind, the one that does long division. The one that constructs a careful argument, reads a legal contract, plans a career decision, or plays a game of chess against someone who is actually good. System 2 is slow, deliberate, logical. It is the seat of genuine critical thinking, of careful reasoning, of everything we mean when we say someone is being rational, and it is the primary home of self-control. Here is where the game is lost, and where most people have no idea they're losing it. System 1 is extraordinarily cheap to run. It operates in the background continuously, consuming almost no cognitive resources, always on, always scanning, always processing. The mental cost of relying on System 1 is essentially zero. System 2 is metabolically expensive. Brutally so. Every time you genuinely reason through something, every time you override an instinct, every time you think carefully before you speak, you are burning real cognitive fuel. This is not a metaphor. Sustained analytical thinking literally consumes glucose. It is why difficult intellectual work makes you physically tired. Because System 2 is so metabolically costly, our brains have evolved a powerful bias toward avoiding it. We default to System 1 constantly and automatically, not because we are careless or unintelligent, but because we are cognitively efficient. System 1 handles somewhere between 90 and 98% of all mental processing on any given day. And in most domains, that works perfectly well. But in high-stakes emotional situations, in precisely the moments where clear, careful thinking matters most, that efficiency becomes a trap. Because System 1 is not equipped for nuanced social judgment. It is built for survival, not for wisdom. Kahneman's colleagues Janet Metcalfe and Walter Mischel took this framework further with a formulation that is even more viscerally clear. They called it the hot system and the cool system. The hot system is your go system. It is reflexive, simple, and stimulus-driven. When something triggers you emotionally, a perceived insult, a threat to your identity, a silence that feels like rejection, the hot system fires first and fastest. It does not evaluate. It does not calculate consequences. It does not pause to ask whether what it is about to do is aligned with your values or your long-term interests. It reacts, full stop. The cool system is your no system. It is contemplative, deliberate, and strategic. It can hold multiple possibilities in mind at once, weigh competing interpretations, simulate future consequences, and choose responses that reflect who you actually want to be, rather than what you feel in the moment of maximum intensity. The relationship between these two systems is not fixed. It changes moment to moment based on your physiological state. When you are calm, rested, safe, not under active threat, both systems run in something like partnership. The cool system can moderate the hot system. It can intercept the impulse and redirect it. It can say, wait, think, is this the response that serves you, or is it just the response your alarm system is demanding? But when you are stressed, when you are threatened, exhausted, humiliated, or afraid, the cool system does not merely slow down. It shuts off. Stress, specifically the hormonal cascade triggered by perceived threat, takes your cool system offline and hands full control of your behavior to the hot system. This is why people say things in arguments they would never say in a calm conversation. Why exceptional professionals make catastrophic judgment calls under pressure. Why that furious email seemed completely justified when you wrote it at midnight and absolutely horrifying when you read it the next morning with fresh eyes. Your hot system was driving the car. And here is the question that should disturb every one of us. In a world designed at every level to keep us in a state of low-grade, persistent stress, how often is our hot system running the show, and how rarely do we even notice it is happening? In the late 1960s, at the Bing Nursery School on the campus of Stanford University, a psychologist named Walter Mischel sat a small child down at a plain table. On the table in front of the child was a single marshmallow. Mischel explained the arrangement simply. I'm going to leave the room. If you wait until I get back about 15 or 20 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows, but if you eat the one in front of you while I'm gone, that's all you get. 1. Then he left. And behind a one-way mirror, researchers watched and recorded. What those recordings captured over the following years is one of the most revealing windows into human self-regulation ever created. Some children ate the marshmallow almost immediately. The door had barely closed before the hand went out. The temptation was too immediate, too real, too hot. Others tried to hold on. They stared at the marshmallow. They sniffed it. They poked it tentatively with one finger and then pulled back as if burned. A few managed to wait several agonizing minutes before finally giving in, the tension between desire and restraint written unmistakably across their faces. But a meaningful minority, roughly 1 in 3 of the children, found ways to wait the full 15 to 20 minutes. And what they did to manage that wait is where the real discovery lives. These children did not simply try harder. They did not white-knuckle their way through the experience on raw willpower alone. That would have failed, as it fails for most adults in most high-stakes situations. Instead, they used strategies. Specific, observable, spontaneous strategies for transforming their internal state, for shifting themselves from a hot, desire-driven condition to a cooler, more regulated one. Some turned their chairs around entirely so their backs were to the marshmallow, out of sight, out of the hot system's reach. Others began singing to themselves, drumming rhythms on the tabletop, or making up small games with their fingers. Anything that redirected attention away from the stimulus and into an activity that kept the cool system engaged. One child pressed her arms tightly against her sides and sat completely still with her eyes shut, as if she were concentrating so intensely on something internal that the external world had temporarily ceased to exist. And one little girl, she became something of a legend in the follow-up discussions, imagined the marshmallow as a photograph in a picture frame, a flat, two-dimensional image, because, she explained when asked later, you can't eat a picture. That child, at 4 years old, had spontaneously invented what cognitive behavioral researchers today call cognitive reappraisal. She had not changed the marshmallow. She had changed the meaning she assigned to it. And that change in meaning changed everything about how her brain processed the stimulus. But the truly extraordinary findings did not come from those laboratory sessions. They came decades later. Mischel and his colleagues tracked those same children as they grew through adolescence and into adulthood, measuring academic performance, health outcomes, relationship quality, financial stability, and psychological well-being across years and even decades. What they found was staggering in its consistency. The children who had waited, the ones who had managed the pause at age 4, went on to score significantly higher on their SATs. They had lower rates of substance abuse and addiction, lower rates of obesity, higher levels of life satisfaction across multiple time points. They reported more fulfilling and more stable long-term relationships. They reached higher levels of professional achievement and financial security. And by every metric the researchers could devise, they demonstrated dramatically higher emotional intelligence, the capacity to perceive, understand, and manage their own emotional states with skill. One pause, one gap between stimulus and response, and its effect echoed across an entire lifetime. For decades following those original studies, the prevailing assumption was that this capacity was largely fixed from early childhood. Some children were born with strong self-regulatory capability, and others were not. The gap was real, and it was, many believed, biological in origin and resistant to change. That assumption has now been extensively and convincingly challenged. Because what the full body of research ultimately revealed is this: the children who waited were not deploying some mysterious inborn reserve of willpower that other children simply lacked. They were using strategies, specific, learnable, transferable strategies for shifting their brains from a hot state to a cool one. Strategies that could, in principle, be taught. Strategies that could, with deliberate and consistent practice, become habitual enough to operate automatically. Self-control is not a personality trait you are born with. It is a cognitive architecture you can construct. History's greatest leaders were not born emotionally detached from the events of their time. They were not flat, they were not unfeeling. Many of them were, in fact, among the most intensely emotional people of their generations, individuals who felt loss, fury, humiliation, and despair with a depth and acuity that those around them sometimes found difficult to witness. What distinguished them was not the absence of feeling, it was their hard-won mastery of the distance between feeling and action. No figure in American history demonstrates this principle more clearly or with more consequence than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not a man who coasted through hardship. His battles with what we would today recognize as severe depression were profound, prolonged, and well documented by people who knew him closely. He grieved openly. He felt the weight of every death, every failure, every fractured relationship with an intensity that was sometimes incapacitating. And yet, from that same emotional depth, he became the leader who held a fractured nation together through its most violent and fractured hour. Not in spite of his emotional life, but in some essential way because of how he learned to work with it. One of the most revealing windows into Lincoln's leadership practice was something he developed over years of political life and refined during the most brutal years of the Civil War. When Lincoln was consumed by anger, truly, viscerally, almost unbearably furious, he would write a letter. Not to send, to write. He called these his hot letters, fully honest, completely unrestrained rebukes addressed to the generals who had failed him, the politicians who had betrayed the cause, the critics who had attacked him in the press. He poured every ounce of his frustration onto the page, without softening a word, without diplomatic hedging, without the careful circumspection he brought to every official communication. And then he put the letter in his desk drawer. He would sleep on it, sometimes for a night, sometimes longer. And in most cases, the letter stayed exactly where he left it. The most famous instance of this practice came in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. General George Meade had just led Union forces to a pivotal, potentially war-ending victory. The Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee was retreating, caught between the Union forces and the flooding Potomac River. Meade had the opportunity to strike, to potentially end the war in a single decisive engagement. He did not strike. He hesitated, delayed his pursuit, and allowed Lee to cross the river and escape into Virginia. Lincoln was devastated, not just frustrated, devastated. He believed, correctly as historians have largely confirmed, that Meade had allowed the war to continue for what would ultimately be another 2 years, at a cost in lives that is almost beyond comprehension. He wrote Meade a letter of quiet, controlled ferocity. It began, "I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely." He never sent it. It was discovered after Lincoln's death, still in the drawer where he had left it, with a notation at the top in his own handwriting, "Never sent, never signed." Lincoln understood at an intuitive level what neuroscience would not be able to formally confirm for another 150 years. The moment of maximum emotional intensity is almost always the worst possible moment for consequential action. When we are in the grip of acute emotional arousal, when cortisol and adrenaline are flooding the system, when the amygdala is fully engaged and the prefrontal cortex is functionally compromised, we are making decisions with our worst mental tools. The reasoning structures we need most for good judgment are precisely the ones most impaired by the neurochemical state we're in. The desk drawer was not just a piece of furniture. It was a deliberate and sophisticated neurological strategy. By inserting time between stimulus and response, between the outrage and the action, Lincoln gave his autonomic nervous system the opportunity to reset. He gave the hormonal storm time to pass. He gave his prefrontal cortex the chance to reclaim its proper role from the amygdala. He let his brain catch up to his feelings. In today's research literature, this is called temporal distancing. And controlled studies consistently confirm that even a 24-hour delay between emotional trigger and response produces significantly more rational, more strategically effective, and more relationship-preserving outcomes than responding in the immediate moment of activation. Every time Lincoln used that drawer, he was buying himself the gap that Viktor Frankl would later describe as the home of all human freedom. As Naval Ravikant has put it, the most valuable skill is not being the smartest, it's being the most unfoolable. And you cannot be unfoolable if you allow your body chemistry to dictate your choices before your reason has had a chance to arrive. To understand exactly why the pause works, what is mechanically happening in the brain when you hold that space rather than collapse it, we need to go inside the brain itself. Nestled directly behind your forehead in a region called the prefrontal cortex is the most sophisticated decision-making structure that evolution has produced in any organism on Earth. Neuroscientists call it the executive center, and the name is precisely right. The prefrontal cortex manages what cognitive science calls executive function, the ability to hold multiple pieces of competing information in working memory simultaneously, to weigh options against each other, to plan across extended timescales, to inhibit impulses that feel compelling in the moment but are destructive over time, and most crucially for our purposes, to choose responses that align with your long-term values rather than your immediate emotional state. The prefrontal cortex is, in a real and measurable sense, the neurological home of wisdom. It is the seat of restraint, of deliberation, of self-authorship. It is what allows you to be more than a collection of reflexes. But the prefrontal cortex does not operate in isolation. It shares the brain with a structure that is older, faster, louder, and under the right conditions, considerably more powerful. Deep in the temporal lobe, beneath and behind the prefrontal cortex, buried at the core of the limbic system, sits a small, dense, almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. The amygdala is ancient. It predates the prefrontal cortex by hundreds of millions of years in evolutionary terms. It evolved in an era when survival depended not on nuanced reasoning but on instantaneous threat detection. Is that shape a predator? Move. Is that sound a warning? Brace. Is that stranger approaching with hostile intent? Fight or flee. The amygdala processes incoming sensory information for threat at extraordinary speed, in under 100 milliseconds in many documented studies. This means that before you have consciously registered that something is happening, your amygdala has already evaluated it, assigned it a threat level, and begun initiating a response. When it detects a threat, whether that threat is a predator on the ancient savanna or a dismissive comment from your manager in a team meeting, it triggers the physiological stress response. A cascade of signals races through the body. Adrenaline and cortisol flood the bloodstream. Your heart rate accelerates, blood pressure rises, breathing shallows, your chest tight, your stomach drops, your peripheral vision narrows. Every non-essential system goes offline. Your body has converted itself into a survival machine. And here is what most people will go their entire lives without knowing. In that moment, the precise moment your amygdala fires, your prefrontal cortex, your executive center, your capacity for rational, values-based judgment does not merely slow down. It loses. Neurologically and functionally, the alarm signal from the amygdala overrides the moderating influence of the prefrontal cortex. The emotional brain seizes operational control from the rational brain. You react before you think, not because you are weak, but because you are temporarily outgunned by a system that evolution prioritized above all others. Daniel Goleman, the psychologist and author who brought emotional intelligence into public discourse, named this moment the amygdala hijack. And it happens to everyone, every day, far more often than most people recognize. But the story does not end there, because inside the brain there exists a structure that determines not whether the hijack attempt happens, it always happens, but whether it succeeds. This structure is called the uncinate fasciculus. The uncinate fasciculus is one of the brain's major white matter tracts, a dense bundle of myelinated nerve fibers running between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, carrying regulatory signals in both directions. Think of it as a bidirectional regulatory highway. When the amygdala fires its alarm, it is the uncinate fasciculus that allows the prefrontal cortex to send inhibitory signals back down, signals that essentially communicate, alarm received, situation under assessment. You can reduce the alert level. People with high structural integrity in the uncinate fasciculus, with a dense, well-developed version of this connecting tract, are significantly better at what neuroscientists call top-down regulation of emotion. When their amygdala fires, their prefrontal cortex can respond quickly enough and forcefully enough to partially intercept the hijack. They feel the surge. They experience the emotional intensity, but they maintain enough rational capacity to choose their behavior rather than simply enacting it. People with weaker connectivity here lose more ground in the tug-of-war. The hijack completes. The hot system drives the car. And now comes the finding that carries the most significant practical implications of anything we have discussed. The uncinate fasciculus is not fully mature until the mid to late 20s. Not metaphorically, physically. The actual neural architecture that allows the rational brain to effectively regulate the emotional brain is not completely formed until a person reaches adulthood, which is precisely why adolescents and young adults consistently appear to older observers to act impulsively on emotion even when they clearly possess the intellectual knowledge of why they shouldn't. It is not a failure of character. Their brakes are not yet physically wired. For those of us past that developmental window, this same biological reality carries a radically more hopeful implication. The uncinate fasciculus, like other neural structures, responds to use. Research in neuroplasticity has now established that consistent mindfulness practice, structured emotional regulation training, and certain forms of cognitive behavioral intervention measurably increase the functional connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. They do not merely change your behavior patterns, they alter the physical structure of your brain. You can build a stronger bridge between your emotions and your reason. You can, with practice, develop a pause that is not effortful, but automatic. But when this bridge is underdeveloped, when the hijack runs its full course, the mind does something particularly damaging in its aftermath. It enters what researchers call a rumination loop. It replays the event, re-examines the words, reconstructs the narrative, asks the same unanswerable questions on repeat. And in the digital world, that loop has been given powerful new machinery. Let me describe something you have almost certainly experienced within the last week. You send a message, a text, or an email, something that carries personal weight, a vulnerability you finally put into words, an important question, an admission you do not make easily. And then you wait. The reply does not come. Instead, you see it, read 2:14 p.m. No response. And something happens in your chest that is disproportionate to the event. You know it is disproportionate even as it is happening, but you cannot stop it. A tightening, a spreading, quiet anxiety, a sequence of thoughts you did not choose but cannot fully redirect. Why does this happen? We have already established the neurobiological foundation. Social rejection, including the perceived rejection of being left unacknowledged in a digital medium, activates the same neural circuitry that processes physical pain. This is not metaphorical. Neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA demonstrated in landmark research using functional MRI that the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region most associated with the direct experience of physical pain, shows virtually identical levels of activation when study subjects experience social exclusion. Being ignored in the language your brain speaks is being hurt. When you are hurt, the amygdala fires. When the amygdala fires, the prefrontal cortex loses the tug-of-war. And this is where the modern digital environment adds a layer of damage that previous generations simply did not face. Your default mode network takes over. The default mode network, or DMN, is a large-scale brain system that becomes most active when you are not engaged with an external task. It is the network responsible for self-referential processing, for thinking about yourself, imagining the mental states of other people, constructing narratives about your social world and your place within it. Under ordinary conditions, the default mode network is invaluable. It is the engine of reflection, of planning, of the ongoing construction of a coherent sense of self. But under social threat, when the amygdala is activated and the silence refuses to resolve, the default mode network turns against you. It picks up the unanswered message and begins working on it. It replays your exact phrasing. It reanalyzes your tone. It wonders whether you were too forward or not clear enough. It constructs possibilities. They are angry, they are disappointed, they are no longer interested, you have done something wrong. It builds a narrative, and in a threat-primed state, the narrative it builds is almost invariably one in which you are the problem. Not because the evidence supports this conclusion, not because it is the most probable explanation among many, but because a brain operating under conditions of social threat is primed by evolutionary design to identify danger. And the most readily available data for constructing a threat narrative is always your own behavior. This is where the critical mistake occurs. The double text. The follow-up message sent not because there is something meaningful to communicate, but because the nervous system has reached its tolerance limit for ambiguity. Uncertainty to the amygdala registers as threat almost as intensely as confirmed rejection. So the anxious message goes out, "Hey, did you get this?" Or "Sorry, never mind," driven not by intention or reason, but by a primitive drive to close an open loop that the brain finds neurologically unbearable. More often than not, this reaction makes the situation worse than sustained silence would have. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's long-term partner and one of the most clear-eyed analytical minds of the 20th century, articulated the core of this mistake with precision. The first rule is that you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try to bang them back. You've got to have the models, and you've got to array the facts on the latticework of models. The same framework applies precisely here. The isolated fact is a read receipt, 2 words beneath a timestamp. If you react to that isolated fact without the full model, without the context of who this person is, what they are likely doing, the dozens of alternative explanations that are at least as probable as rejection, you will construct the wrong story. Then you will act on that story. Then the story will become self-fulfilling in ways you never intended and may not be able to reverse. There is something important to say about the environment in which all of this is happening. Read receipts, typing indicators, online now markers, the granular precision of seen 3 minutes ago. These are not accidental features. They are deliberate design decisions, and whatever their original stated purpose, their consistent neurobiological effect is to keep your threat detection system in a state of continuous low-grade activation. They create a form of ambient social monitoring that your nervous system was never built to sustain. They feed the default mode network an endless stream of ambiguous social data and then sit back while the rumination loop runs. The platforms that built these features profit from your engagement, and nothing drives engagement quite like anxiety. The deliberate, trained capacity to sit with digital silence without reacting to it is not a minor personal preference. It is one of the most important forms of neurological self-defense available to anyone living in the modern world. And the research, precise, replicable, and increasingly well understood, offers concrete tools for developing it. The answer begins, it turns out, with a single word. Researchers at UCLA, including neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman, whose work on the social brain is among the most extensively replicated in modern cognitive science, discovered something surprising about what occurs in the brain when we simply name what we are feeling. The technique is called affect labeling, and its neurological effects are immediate and measurable. When you are in a state of emotional activation, in the grip of anger, anxiety, shame, the particular ache of perceived rejection, Simply finding accurate, specific words to describe your emotional state produces a significant reduction in amygdala activity. Not modest, significant. And the precision of the labeling matters. I feel disrespected produces a stronger regulatory effect than I feel bad. I'm experiencing anticipatory anxiety is more powerful than I'm nervous. The more accurately and granularly you can name the feeling, the more pronounced the calming effect on the emotional alarm system. What happens neurologically is that the act of labeling engages a region of the prefrontal cortex called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Once activated, this region sends inhibitory signals back down to the amygdala, functioning, in the language of the researchers, as a symbolic shunt, an emotional pressure valve. The act of accurately naming your emotion tells the amygdala this experience is being processed. You can stand down. This is why journaling produces immediate relief even when nothing in your circumstances has changed. This is why talking to someone who genuinely listens helps even when they offer no solutions. The act of translating raw emotional experience into language changes the brain's relationship to that experience in real time. Labeling is the starting point. From there, high-functioning individuals under emotional pressure tend to use a small set of additional strategies that researchers have formalized under what is called the STOP protocol. Stop, take a breath, observe, proceed. Stop means physically arresting the behavioral impulse before it executes. Not suppressing the emotion. Suppression, the research consistently shows, actually increases physiological arousal and makes regulation harder, not easier. Just interrupting the output, taking your hand away from the keyboard, putting the phone face down, pausing before the first word leaves your mouth, creating a micro gap between the impulse and the action. Take a breath is not motivational advice. It is a direct neurobiological intervention. A slow, deliberate exhale, particularly one that extends the out-breath to roughly twice the length of the in-breath, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the autonomic nervous system that serves as the physiological counterweight to the stress response. It reduces circulating cortisol. It slows the heart rate. It narrows the amygdala's activation window. A single controlled breath does not eliminate the emotional state, but it reduces its intensity, and in that reduced intensity, System 2 gains just enough traction to begin functioning. Observe means watching what is happening inside you without immediately acting on it, not judging, not arguing with the emotion or trying to rationalize it out of existence, not labeling yourself as weak or irrational for experiencing it, just noting with careful, neutral attention. I notice the urge to respond immediately. I notice I am interpreting this silence as rejection. I notice my chest is tight and my thinking is becoming narrow. The observation creates critical distance, the thin but decisive gap between experiencing an emotion and being governed by it. Proceed means choosing your response from that more grounded, more oxygenated, more rational place, aligning your action with your actual values rather than your immediate biochemistry. Sometimes the response you choose will be exactly what your gut initially suggested. Sometimes the first instinct is correct, but the difference is categorical. You are now choosing rather than being driven. The second major tool that appears throughout the research on emotional intelligence and high performance is cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is the deliberate act of examining and consciously adjusting the meaning you assign to a situation, not wishful thinking, not denial, not telling yourself things are fine when they clearly are not. It is the recognition that most situations genuinely contain multiple plausible interpretations, and that your brain, in a threat-activated emotional state, will default to the most threatening available interpretation, regardless of whether that interpretation is the most accurate one. Instead of "they haven't replied because I don't matter to them," you try "they haven't replied because they're genuinely overwhelmed right now." Instead of "my manager corrected me because they think I'm incompetent," you try "my manager corrected me because they are paying close attention to my work." James Gross at Stanford, arguably the world's leading researcher on the science of emotion regulation, has compiled decades of evidence showing that people who consistently practice cognitive reappraisal experience lower levels of negative affect, stronger personal relationships, higher well-being across multiple dimensions, and measurably lower physiological stress responses when exposed to the same objective stressors as people who do not use this strategy. Reappraisal does not just change how you feel about a situation. It changes how your body responds to it. So how do you make any of this real? Because this is exactly where most content in this genre ultimately fails. The science resonates, the examples land, and then real life arrives, a message that stings, a meeting that goes sideways, a silence that stretches, and every framework you just encountered evaporates the moment you need it most. Here are 3 protocols, grounded in the research and usable immediately. The first is the Lincoln desk drawer, the 24-hour draft rule. For any high-stakes emotional communication, a reply to someone who has frustrated or hurt you, a response to a difficult dynamic at work or at home, a message to someone you are angry with, write out exactly what you want to say. Do not sanitize it. Do not soften it. Write the full, honest, unfiltered version and let the heat go onto the page where it can do no damage. Then save it as a draft, close it, and commit to not sending it for at least 24 hours. What you will discover with a consistency that is almost startling is that the version you want to send the next day is different. It is often clearer, more targeted, and more aligned with what you actually want the outcome to be. The heat has passed. The prefrontal cortex has returned to its proper function. The desk drawer is your draft folder. Lincoln figured this out in the 1860s. The second protocol is the 10-second rule in conversation. When a difficult question lands, one that triggers defensiveness or fear or pride, before you respond, pause deliberately. Count 10 seconds internally if you need to. This will feel uncomfortable. We are conditioned to treat conversational silence as inadequacy. But here is what actually happens. A deliberate, unhurried pause communicates confidence at a level that words rarely achieve. It signals that you are not afraid of the question, that you are not scrambling for a defense, that your response is worth the time it takes to form. The person across from you does not fill your silence, they wait. And the person who is comfortable in silence holds the conversational frame. The third protocol is the third-person reframe, what clinical researchers call cognitive diffusion. When you are in the grip of a strong emotion, deliberately shift from first-person immersive language to third-person observational language. Instead of "I am furious," try "I notice that your name is experiencing anger right now." Instead of "I can't believe this is happening," try "I notice that your name is feeling blindsided." This sounds unusual the first time you practice it. It can feel almost theatrical. But the research behind it is robust. Third-person self-talk reduces emotional reactivity, improves the quality of reasoning about personally charged situations, and produces measurably wiser decision-making under stress. It creates the same psychological distance the child at Stanford created when she decided that the marshmallow was just a picture. You are not less than your emotions, but you are also more than them. Cognitive diffusion gives the rational mind the foothold it needs. We live in a world that has been meticulously and profitably engineered to keep your amygdala on high alert. Read receipts, notification counts, algorithmic feeds calibrated by systems that have learned with extraordinary precision which images, which headlines, which social signals will generate the most sustained emotional activation. An entire attention economy whose underlying business model depends at some level on your reactivity. And the only genuine antidote is the mastery of the pause. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps. He lost his parents, his brother, and his wife. He emerged from the outer limit of human suffering and wrote one of the most important books of the century. And in it, he arrived at the same truth that Lincoln, Jobs, Bezos, Kahneman, and Mischel each discovered through entirely different paths. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." That space is everything. Intelligent people do not react immediately because they understand that their power does not live in the reaction. It lives in the pause. The person who cannot wait, who must always fire back, always fill the silence, always send the message before the storm has passed, is not being authentic. They are being driven. But you have something now. You have the space, and you know exactly what to do with it.